Kokoro Audio and China Literature presents Part 1 of the Inheritor of Magic, the Magi King series by Aoki Aku. Performed and narrated by a full cast.
Wolfe looked down at the drill in his hands, and then back to the recharging inscription on the table beside him. Sure, it was a crime to create a fake spell inscription, but how would the witches ever know it was him? He needed some quick cash, and the guard patrols that had actual witches among them almost never came this far down into the lower levels anyhow. Ever since the war between the Magi and the witch covens, who had allied with all the world's mundane armies and wiped out every Magi strong enough to activate even a simple cantrip, the covens had ruled this portion of the world. In some ways, it was for the betterment of society, with magic being integrated with technology to create new and wondrous devices. Still, it had come at a cost beyond the devastation of a global thermonuclear war. Only those with witch blood could activate the enchantments, and their skills were needed to power them when the initial charge ran out. Of course, they were happy to do so, as long as you could pay. They began marketing mana crystals that anyone could use to recharge magical items, bringing magic into the mainstream for every citizen under their rule. Over time, mana replaced the entire mundane power grid within the fortress cities that the survivors had sheltered in to ride out the aftermath of the war. It was clean energy, infinitely renewable, and, best of all, hoardable. The wealthiest could physically hold them, ensuring their access to magic even without a witch nearby. But without the noble bloodline, they couldn't create them, so they would never be more than wealthy. The witches were the true aristocrats, and 100 years after the war, they had the governments of the slowly recovering nations codify it into law. Sure, a few resisted, but they couldn't last long when facing an opponent who could deactivate their entire nation's infrastructure on a whim. The coven leaders, more commonly called the queens, pulled the mana out of the energy grids of those who opposed them, sending entire fortress cities with populations of millions back to the Stone Age until they repented. That was how the dream of equality and democracy died long before Wolfe was born. The monopoly of the witches on magical items, thanks to their exclusive ability to use magic, was what Wolfe was planning to take advantage of today. Magical items were expensive, but useful. The inscription that the drawing he had in front of him was copied from would keep the batteries of a power tool charged for a month with a single unit of energy from a mana crystal. A unit was worth 10 credits. Not a high price to pay, but the inscription itself was worth 300 credits. If he could inscribe it onto this plain drill from the pawn shop, he could clean and resell the tool for 200 credits after the pawn shop took their cut off the top. Nobody would ever know the inscription was fake until the batteries died and they tried to refresh it. You couldn't add more mana to an active inscription, so the shop should think that the tool was authentic and active, not just freshly recharged from the wall outlet. He would have to do that later. The pawn shop owner he bought it from was too cheap to use his own electricity to recharge even a simple power tool, so the drill was stone dead right now. Using the copy of the inscription as a template, Wolfe carefully inscribed the lines into the battery pack, then filled the etching with silver paint. It should have real silver and a number of other ingredients to make the spell work. But even if Wolfe had been born into a witch-blooded family, he was a young man, not a noble daughter who could possibly use magic. Wolfe added the final symbols to the circle, and suddenly, a stabbing pain shot through his hand like he had been burned.
Ow! Damn it! I thought I checked that this thing was discharged first. It shouldn't have shocked me even if I carved too deep.
Hopefully he hadn't damaged the battery pack. The whole hoax would be worthless if the tool were broken. The lights on the battery pack were glowing now, showing 1% battery. Then 2 and 3. As Wolfe watched, the charge indication climbed until the pack showed fully charged. There was no way that the inscription worked. Every kid in the city knew someone who had been scammed by a reseller peddling forged magical items. If just drawing the circle was enough, the witches would never have gained the level of power they had, and every item would be a magical item within a week of being purchased. Hesitantly, Wolfe pulled the trigger, and the drill spun to life, happily whirring away with a full battery. Wolfe's thoughts were racing in joy at his discovery.
It worked? That's simply not possible. But if it really worked, doesn't that mean I can sell these anywhere without fear of being called out? Even the high-end shops that pay top dollar wouldn't turn me away if the enchantment actually worked.
The rumor in the neighborhood was that the Noxus family were descended from Magi who had escaped the culling, and that the current family head, Wolfe's distant relative, who he courteously referred to as his uncle, could kill people with a touch. Wolfe had always taken that as superstition, as he had personally seen his uncle shoot a failed assassin from another family. But now, he wondered if there might be some truth to it. The problem was that if he openly tried to verify his lineage and abilities, there were no good outcomes for him. If the rumors were false, he would be humiliated and chastised for spreading rumors that damaged the reputation of the family. The Coven laws would issue the death penalty to any man who showed an affinity for magic, and sometimes even witches who practiced magic without being a member of the Coven. Either way, an actual magic user who wasn't a witch was unheard of in the past few centuries. If they found out he could use this power, the Noxus family wouldn't risk him being exposed and having a rival family capture him for their own ends. The ability to actually use magic was far too precious of a secret to let anyone else learn of it. So Wolfe made a plan. He would go to the pawn shop and pretend to be retiring as a construction worker to move into a better career. He was old enough to have finished his basic education now, and with the Noxus family name, the act would be believable. He even had the family tattoo on his arm to verify his gainful employment story. He would enchant 3 more batteries if he could get the inscription to work again, and then sell 2 full sets of tools, each with a spare battery. That would net him an easy 1,000 credit profit, and he would be set for at least a month. It was a scam he could only run once at 2 different shops in different territories. But Wolfe was more interested in learning about what he could do with these newfound powers. The world he grew up in was a relatively good one, at least for someone allied with a strong crime family who could claim a large portion of one of the floors within the fortress city as their own territory. But it would be better with more power. The Noxus family took him into the family business after the unfortunate demise of his parents in a car accident. Like the hundreds of other families that populated the lower floors, they were more closely related to a pre-war criminal organization than a mundane corporation. It was a life that many in the city dreamed of, even with the inherent risks. Wolfe thought back to what he could recall from the history classes he had taken in school, hoping that something in those lessons could help in this situation. The war between the Magi and the rest of the world had devastated the planet, to the point it was only now recovering. Humanity had moved into fortress cities, sheltered against the pollution and radioactive fallout of the war. Where the witches excelled in nature magic, potions, and enchantments, the Magi had been innate elemental magic users. When the world turned against them, they did not go down easily. The exact details had been scrubbed from history to discourage anyone from attempting to emulate their actions. But what everyone knew was that a large portion of one continent was lost to the seas, dragged under by overwhelming Earth elemental magic that shifted the tectonic plates. That was when the mundane armies resorted to nuclear weapons. The citizens were herded to the newly created fortress cities for their safety as the war engulfed the world. None of that really helped Wolfe, but it did give him hope that maybe he could do more than just recharge batteries. Maybe he could recharge mana crystals as well. They might be used to recharge magical items, but they were legal currency with a value set by their current charge. How awesome would it be if he could create his own money?
Empty mana crystals were worthless and sent for recycling, so he could grab handfuls of them from bins all over the territory to experiment on. With his plan firmly in place,
Wolfe began to inscribe the circles on the other batteries he had purchased, being extra careful not to make any errors that might cause the inscription to fail. He had no idea what it took to get the magic to work, so Wolfe focused hard on recharging the battery and making the perfectly drawn inscription. When the second one came alive with a shock through his hand, Wolfe realized what was happening. The inscribed circle created electricity, and he was using a metal-handled stylus and metallic paint to create it. He was getting shocked by the initial charge flowing from him through his tools. That might be necessary to the process, though, so Wolfe didn't change anything as he did the last two and started on the long process of cleaning and repairing the tools, so they only looked gently used and not nearly demolished like they did when he got them. When they were good enough, Wolfe packed one set of power tools and 2 batteries into his backpack. This would be the rough part, as the high-end shops he wanted to sell to were on a higher floor, and getting there without a fight could be difficult. His family only operated on one floor, and he wasn't going to sell sketchy items to his own neighbors. So he would have to cross through other floors to get to a suitable shop where nobody would recognize his face. Wolfe knew a thing or two about fights, and had the flattened nose and scarred knuckles to prove it. At 180 centimeters, he wasn't the biggest of men, but he was large enough to hold his own, and growing up in public schools on the lower floors had given his gray eyes a hard look that didn't match his age. With a full pack, Wolfe looked at his trusty electric delivery bicycle, freshly charged and ready for a hard ride through the city. Most of the trip was going to be easy to pass through, but a few areas belonged to families that didn't like visitors from the lower floors. It was a risk, but if he managed it, nobody would suspect him if there turned out to be a problem with the tools later. The witches had eyes everywhere. He definitely couldn't sell fake inscriptions in his own territory and cause trouble for his uncle. So, he tightened the straps on his backpack and set off on his money-making adventure for the day.
Hey, Wolfe, where are you off to today?
The enforcer stationed at the ramp that led to the floors above their territory asked.
Gotta head to the upper floors. See a man about a thing? You know how it is for a delivery rider.
Cars weren't common in their district since so few went very far from home. Instead, the roads were filled with electric bikes, magic-powered electric delivery trucks, and the odd taxi. It was all lit from above by magical lights that gave off a soft yellow light that Wolfe had been told was a close simulation of the sun's natural light. But he had personally never left the city to see if that was true.
If you're going to the upper floors, be careful. The family can't help you there, but I'll be waiting here by the border in case you need to come back in a hurry.
Thanks. Hopefully I won't need the help, but I know the signal.
The guards upstairs waved as he passed by, recognizing him as a Noxus family delivery rider, and he sped through the streets toward the ramp which would lead him up another floor as close as possible to the location of the shop he had chosen. It was better to be on the right side of the city when he left the friendly territory, so that he would have as few neutral territory entries and exits as possible. Frequently going too far from home attracted attention that Wolfe really didn't want today, and fewer territory crossings meant fewer chances someone would notice him and check his identity. There weren't actually any laws against moving around most of the city, but the witches were always watching for suspicious activity. Little things like gangsters moving drugs and stolen goods out of their territory, or fencing fake magical items. Things Wolfe was off to do today. Every area of the city was more of the same, but there were some slight differences. The floor he was currently on used coral colors, whereas Wolfe's was covered with shades of gray and brown. He made a careful note of everything he passed in case he needed to make up a lie about his origins later. His luck was good today, though. There were no traffic jams and nobody questioned him as he crossed 4 floors to get to the area where he wanted to sell his tools. This wasn't technically an upper floor, but it was a community where most of the residents worked on the upper floors. Unlike his own home territory, the guards here were actual Coven police, and security wasn't left to the families. It was a strange feeling cycling past them at a sedate pace that matched traffic and trying not to attract their attention. It wasn't hard to find the spot he wanted. The Council Construction Materials sign stood tall and proud above the surrounding stores. It was well known as a quality used tool dealer, but Wolfe had specifically chosen it for the owners dealing with the Noxus family in the past. He wouldn't bring them into it if he didn't have to, but the affiliation would help him if he had trouble convincing the store clerks to let him leave without recording his real name.
Wolfe parked his bike in the racks out front and walked straight for the front doors, knowing full well that convincing people that you knew what you were doing got you through more crimes than anything else. The greeter at the door, a young girl, most likely a school student working part-time, looked at his broken nose and durable clothing before nodding, seemingly satisfied that he belonged there.
Welcome to Council Construction. How can we help you today?
I've gotten a job as a delivery worker, and I'd like to sell my power tools to upgrade my cycle.
His bike looked rather plain and worn, but internally he had already upgraded it with a new state-of-the-art Magitech motor and higher capacity battery pack.
Moving up in the world. I hear the tips that delivery drivers get are pretty good, but there's no way I could do it.
The greeter gestures for someone else to join them at the door.
This is Ron. He is one of our in-house experts, and I'm certain he can get you a good price for your tools.
Ron? I'm Paul. Good to meet you. I inherited some quality stuff from my late father, and now that I'm changing careers, I'm looking to sell the power tools, which are still in good shape. Forgive me if I don't get rid of the rest. A little insurance never goes wrong.
Never sell your daddy's hand tools.
The man led Wolfe toward a small counter to the side of the shop. Wolfe emptied his pack, bringing out the 8 tools and 2 batteries.
Both batteries have working inscriptions. They've even got some time left on them.
Now, that's considerate of you. We've got a commoner witch on staff, but her services aren't free.
Commoner witches were the weakest and poorest of their kin, unable to use powerful enough magic to earn a title of their own, and cut off from most of the lifestyle benefits of their bloodline. They still earned pretty good money, just not the millions of credits a year that most of the others made. Ron called the witch over, and Wolfe began to sweat. He had no way of knowing if she could see through the fact he made the inscription and that a witch didn't do it.
Have you at least tested the batteries before calling me over?
The portly older woman asked the moment she arrived, causing Ron to look down in embarrassment.
No, ma'am. I'm sorry. I will do that now.
Ron plugged the battery into a testing station on his bench, and a light above them began to shine bright, rapidly draining the pack. Wolfe had expected this test in any reputable shop, which was why he would have gone elsewhere if the inscription didn't work. With the pack drained to 50%, Ron removed it from the device and turned the display so that everyone present could see the reading. He attached a voltmeter to the connectors and watched to make sure the voltage increase matched the reading, nodding happily at the result.
Boy, where did you get that battery from?
It was my father's before he passed. I'm not sure where he got it from.
My condolences on your loss. You must have paid top dollar for it. The charging rate is better than average. To be honest, I had expected grade F trash, but that is a solid D. Close to a C grade charging rate.
Wolfe didn't know what the cutoffs were, but knowing that his first attempt was average was a relief.
Well, put the other one on the tester, stupid. I can't believe you called me over for a perfectly good battery pack.
Wolfe was starting to suspect her animosity was personal. Either that or Ron was not particularly well liked at his job. The second one seemed to discharge faster, but it also recharged a bit faster. The witch didn't look upset, much to Wolfe's relief, and she wrote up a sales slip for Ron.
1 D plus grade and 1 D grade battery. Your father must have bought them at different times. The cells inside one are more worn out.
Wolfe nodded his agreement. Since he had bought these used, he couldn't say anything for sure about their quality.
Since the quality is better than usual for a used construction tool, I can offer you $200 for the worn-out battery and $250 for the other, plus $400 for the tools.
That's better than expected. You got yourself a deal.
Wolfe agreed, shaking the appraiser's hand. The deal was done, and it was time for him to get out of there before anyone thought to ask for identification. With his deal done, Wolfe quickly made his way back home, not intending to stop until he reached the Noxus family's territory. He got more than a few angry shouts as he raced through the streets, but that was a normal part of every day for a delivery rider, and he simply ignored them as he always did, as he raced through the streets well beyond the 30 kilometers an hour speed limit imposed on stock vehicles. The border guard from before waved at Wolfe as he approached in the closest lane of traffic.
So, how did it go? Make some money?
It was a good day. I should be able to go an entire week without a side hustle.
The pedestrians around them shook their heads as they passed by. Nobody went an entire week in the city without at least trying to make a little something on the side. It was just common sense that you could never get ahead with only a legitimate job. The guard gave him a thumbs-up congratulations, and Wolfe darted back out into the traffic, dodging the slower-moving cycles and pedestrians crossing the road wherever they pleased. Making his way through the cookie-cutter apartment blocks of his floor's residential area, Wolfe kept his pace slow enough not to attract an unusual level of attention while keeping his eyes open for danger. Normally, none of the denizens of these cinder block-lined alleys would bother him, but you could never be too safe, and he wasn't totally without personal enemies. He had stepped on more than a few toes to get where he was, and rival couriers would often look for an excuse to mess with strangers, at least until he got further back into Noxus family territory. In under 15 minutes, his own apartment building came into sight, and Wolfe made his way back to his one-bedroom apartment, a boring place with tan walls and synthetic wood floors. He could afford better, but Wolfe had dreams of moving up in life, so he was saving all the money he could until he could buy a home instead of renting like his parents did all their life. Uncle Ivan, head of the Noxus family, was very wealthy, but only an uncle in name. Wolfe's branch of the family was many generations removed and had previously lived down on the lowest floors of the city, where the very poorest and most desperate citizens congregated and struggled to get away from. The relationship was enough to land him a job and a loan when he was in a tight spot after his parents' death, but that was about as far as it went. As the witches said, filth settles to the bottom, and the lower levels were not a great place to live. But they were home until Wolfe came to his uncle's territory and saw how much better things could be if someone took charge where the Coven didn't care to. Looking back on his childhood now, Wolfe had often wondered how things had gotten so bad in the lower levels, but he could see no obvious reason for their condition. It was simply how things were. He settled in the one large recliner that made up what passed for his living room and took out the few empty monocrystals he had not tossed in the recycling. Wolfe had no idea how to recharge them, but the inscriptions had gone smoothly enough, so he had high hopes that he could do this as well. With the empty crystals set on the table in front of him, Wolfe began to focus on the feeling of energy in his fingertips that he got when he inscribed the circles on the battery packs. He could clearly recall the feeling and was certain that it would work to create the circle again, but it had no effect on the crystal. He had been handling these all his life. Surely, if it were that easy, he would have discovered it by accident before age 18. What kid hasn't held one of these crystals and wished they had the power of the witches to create wealth for themselves out of thin air? Sure, there were laws against doing exactly that to keep the commoner witches in line. But to the practical mind of Wolfe, who rarely had any dealings with them, it seemed like a minor thing that nobody would notice unless you went overboard. He didn't and couldn't know that these crystals had a specific energy signature to them. If a witch touched one, she could tell who made the crystal itself and if the energy inside was from the same person. There was a chance that it could have been made and filled by a witch she was unfamiliar with, but the mismatch would immediately alert the Coven that someone had been refilling monocrystals without authorization. In that way, the stored energy was strictly regulated, with each witch being given a certain allowance to create monthly based on their rank. In theory, an illegally filled crystal could be passed around or used without issue, but businesses would return the ones they didn't need to immediately use to the bank every night, where the crystals would be verified and credits issued. The city, as all the residents called their megalithic home, housed over 20 million human beings, of which fewer than 10,000 were witches. Meeting one in person at the shop really was a surprise, and not in a good way, at least not for Wolfe, who was as far from a fanboy of the rulers of their society as could possibly exist. Sure, the young ones were cute, but there were plenty of good-looking women in the city without the attitude that came with a noble upbringing. The commoner witches who would take such a position, even part-time, made up 2/3 of that 10,000 witch number, and were the very weakest of their covens. But still, they were a rare sight for someone like Wolfe. Something like seeing a celebrity or a CEO, a down-on-their-luck, lesser-known one, but still a rare occurrence on his level of the city. Once he was comfortable, Wolfe opened the browser on his computer to look up videos relating to the crystals. There should be something to be found on the network. Even a short documentary about them would help him in his efforts to recharge the ones he had. The first one he found was about the colors of the crystals. They were related to the specialty of the witch that made them, as each had their own technique for growing mana crystals. The empty ones Wolfe had were blue, and the video said they were grown in water, along with a secret assortment of reagents, then fed energy by the Coven member to charge them. It was portrayed as a very dangerous and draining activity, with the risk and effort both contributing to the stored mana's worth. Still, somehow Wolfe suspected that the reality was much more mundane. It did give him an idea, though. Like everyone else who collected payments daily, he had a crystal testing pad, which would tell him the remaining energy content and therefore the value. So Wolfe checked the first of his empty crystals, making sure he hadn't missed a few stored credits. It was verified fully drained, so Wolfe washed it clean and put it in his favorite soup pot with some water, then turned up the stove a little so that the water wasn't icy cold. Getting them wet didn't do anything, but he hoped that if he put his hand in the pot with the crystal and tried the energy to his fingertip thing again, he might have some luck in getting the charge to transfer. Focusing on himself, Wolfe could feel a bit of energy in his chest, right near his heart. Extending that feeling to his hand made the water glow for a brief moment, then fade away.
Hell yeah! This is it! I'm sure of it.
But when he tried again, it was much harder, and Wolfe began to feel exhausted almost immediately. All he could think of, while his eyes drooped and sleep threatened to overcome him, was to turn the stove off, nap, and try again tomorrow. Wolfe was so tired, he didn't even stop to check how much he had managed to get the crystal to absorb, or even if the experiment had worked at all. When he fell asleep, Wolfe was still wondering if he had just burned himself out, making a pot of water glow. When Wolfe woke up a few hours later, he felt much better. All of the exhaustion had vanished as if it had never existed, and he was ready to see his progress. He rolled out of bed, straightened the clothes that he fell asleep wearing, and headed for the kitchen. Wolfe slowly approached the stove and peered into the pot, praying that his efforts last night had paid off. The dull blue crystal lay right where he left it, in the bottom of the soup pot, just waiting to be fished out and dried off so it could be tested. As far as Wolfe knew, a fully charged crystal and an empty one looked exactly the same, which is why the crystal testing pads were necessary. Wolfe tried to calm his shaking hands as he moved the small storage device from the pot to the testing pad, then closed his eyes and pressed the power button.
Please, whoever is listening, let this have worked.
He opened his eyes and looked at the reading. 30 units. That was 300 credits. Or, if you looked at it another way, 2 entire months' power bill. He could use this crystal right now to charge the storage bank in the basement of his building and not need to pay an energy bill this month or next. That was a big thing to Wolfe. Power was expensive, especially for a courier who needed to recharge his bike every day. So, Wolfe set the crystal aside and set another empty one on the testing pad. Once he verified that it was indeed at 0, he washed the crystal and placed it in the pot. It was what he did last time, and he didn't know if a dirty crystal made a difference, so he would continue to wash them. Innovation wasn't even in his thought process. He had found a way that somewhat worked, and he wasn't about to mess it up by trying new things until his immediate problems were solved. This time, he focused more on making a slow but steady flow from himself into the pot and watched as the blue light swirled around the crystal. Once he started feeling woozy, Wolfe stopped the process and sat down to recover, focusing on his breathing, the same as he did after a hard trip on the bike. That seemed to help, and in only 10 minutes, he was ready to get up and check the pot. It looked the same as before, and the blue light had faded to nothing, leaving just the crystal in the soup pot. If he was going to keep doing this, he needed to get something more dignified. Plus, that was his only pot, and he was hungry. Carefully placing the freshly charged crystal on the mat, Wolfe hit the power button again and waited patiently for the reading to come up. 30 units, the same result as before, so that must be the extent of his abilities in one attempt. If he could do that one more time, he would have his entire month's rent and power bill before lunch. But the question was, how should he convert these units to credits to pay the landlord? The power bill could be paid in units, but the rent could not. The cranky old property owner only took credits. Wolfe wasn't brave enough to cash them at a bank in case they could be traced back to him, but he did have a few leads. Businesses that would take units at a discount to power their factory and not ask how you got them. Credits are digital and hard to steal. As physical objects, crystals are the easier, yet still a lucrative target, comparable to the legendary days before the war when credits were metal coins and larger denominations were on paper notes called cash. The companies only gave you half price though, and his rent was 500 credits. Wolfe had enough to pay the bills after trading away the power tools, but they'll never stop coming, no matter how often he paid them off. But once he had enough, he could buy a unit of his own and use these crystals to keep it powered without buying from the grid. Wolfe could imagine the easy life already. But first, he needed to work on his skills and increase the amount he could charge a crystal daily. When they're distributed, a full crystal is worth 100 units, though nobody ever had a full crystal on them in the city, at least not more than an hour after payday. Even if he hadn't purchased anything with it, you would charge your devices and home energy storage first, so you didn't have that many units on you when you went shopping, since the store's withdrawal machines show the current balance to anyone who happens to be nearby. After a bit more rest, Wolfe moved the second crystal back to the pot and prepared his mind to try again. The stress seemed to be entirely mental, with a mild burning in his chest, where the energy seemed to originate. Both of those issues were tolerable to Wolfe in the name of wealth and progress, so he began the recharging attempt again. This time, he tried to add energy as slowly as he could, watching the crystal absorb it as he went instead of letting it light up the water. At first, that seemed less stressful on his body, but the end result was the same: mental exhaustion and a headache. Instead of sleeping, Wolfe tried to meditate. The old folk insisted that it was the best way to clear your mind, and that there were many other benefits that Wolfe had never experienced. He wasn't sleepy, just drained from spell casting, if you could call what he'd done a spell, that is. Wolfe focused on his breathing and the burning feeling in his chest, trying to calm it down. The meditation was quick to relieve the burning, and after a few minutes, Wolfe could feel the energy begin flowing into his body. It was soothing, like a mint balm cooling his body. Wolfe found himself feeling better than he ever had before. All of the fatigue and old aches from years as a delivery rider began to fade as he meditated. Still, more importantly, that spot of energy in the middle of his chest began to feel like a pouch, holding energy that Wolfe was certain he could use later. Wolfe continued meditating until the pouch of what he could only assume was mana in his chest felt full and wouldn't hold anymore. The action seemed natural, as if he had always known what to do on an instinctive level and only had to try it once to awaken the memories. It was an incredible feeling, like he was whole and complete for the first time in his life, but with a hint of weakness, like a newborn who had just taken its first breath. The process had taken much longer than expected, and his watch showed it was already afternoon. He really had to get to work now, as he hadn't planned on neglecting his courier job entirely, just taking the morning to rest up after a good haul yesterday. The courier company was one of the best places on the level to work, and skipping a full day without notice was a great way to get yourself fired. Wolfe turned his phone on and checked the courier app for nearby deliveries. There was a good order from just down the street going to the Noxus main house that nobody had picked up yet, so Wolfe quickly accepted it and grabbed the 2 crystals plus his bike on the way out. Pushing himself as hard as he could to make up for lost time, Wolfe noticed that his legs seemed just a bit stronger today, and he wasn't getting tired as fast as usual. The meditation had really helped, he decided, as he kept pedaling as hard as he could, testing his limits. A faster courier made more money, and Wolfe was one of the best already. The order was ready and waiting when he arrived at the restaurant, but it was still steamy, so he wasn't too far off the ready time. The cashier greeted Wolfe as he jogged in with his courier bag.
Must be a busy day today. It's not often that we wait that long for a confirmation.
Yeah, I started late today, and I was pretty shocked to see you with an active order. No worries, though. I'll get it there on time. Who's the contact?
Wolfe double-checked to make sure that the order was correct.
Butler James, same as usual. He's expecting it in 12 minutes.
Wolfe loaded his bag and jogged back out. He locked the bag to the back rack on his electric bicycle and raced out into the traffic, overtaking most of the slower-moving vehicles. The speed limit in the city was only 30 kilometers an hour, and most vehicles held to that in order to save energy, but not Wolfe. That was why he used a modified electric bike with the speed limiter disabled and not a moped. He could add his own efforts to increase his speed and not use up the battery. At his usual speed, the main house was 15 minutes away, but Wolfe was practically flying today as he wove through the lunchtime crowd. Traffic control always looked the other way for couriers speeding, so he didn't slow down at all, except when he reached a red light. Even then, he ducked around the line of traffic, using the oncoming lanes so he could get to the front and sped off the moment the light changed. After only 9 minutes, he was at the gates to the Noxus main house, where an unexpected sight greeted him. It was not Butler James that came to collect the order, but Uncle Ivan himself.
Young Wolfe, it is good to see you again. Come. You should take some time off and come inside. There's a small family gathering today, and you should meet some of the others now that you've turned 18. It's good you came today. Saves me the trouble of having to look for you.
Uncle Ivan was a huge and intimidating man, broad in the shoulder and over 2 meters tall with salt and pepper hair. Wolfe unlocked the delivery bag, since the butler wasn't there with the tray to collect the order, and reached out his hand to greet the family patriarch with the family's unique handshake. The moment their hands touched, a spark of energy flowed between them, and Uncle Ivan's eyes opened wide in shock. He pulled Wolfe in close by the hand.
It seems we have a lot to talk about. Don't leave after dinner. And keep your gloves on when you're greeting anyone but the elders, okay?
Uncle Ivan moved to lead Wolfe inside the immaculate white plantation-style house. Wolfe followed the patriarch of his family into the dining room, where 40 or so men had gathered, all sharing the same dark hair as Wolfe had and similar facial features. Butler James quickly collected the delivery bag and gave Wolfe a wink and a tip, the same as their usual routine. The takeout would be for the children, as they probably wouldn't truly appreciate the spiced sausages and cabbage Wolfe could smell cooking in the kitchen. Until very recently, Wolfe himself had been with them on the rare occasions that he was there for the monthly gatherings, eating restaurant food in the small side room and socializing with the other youngsters. This would be his first monthly dinner in the adults' dining hall, and he had completely forgotten about it. Not that he had gotten an invitation or a reminder. The Noxus family didn't do that. You were either here for the dinner or you weren't, and it only mattered if you were a topic of conversation in a negative way. Everyone had jobs and lives outside the house, other than a select few, and Uncle Ivan didn't judge based on attendance. One of the older men welcomed Wolfe to the room.
Hey, don't worry about the ladies. They retired to the sitting room until dinner, so we don't bore them to death with talk of work.
Roman, you know Wolfe, yes? He just turned 18 and has joined the family properly.
Is that so? Very good, very good.
Roman replied with a smile, then removed his glove to shake Wolfe's hand. The moment their bare skin touched, that same feeling of energy passed between them, making the old man look even more pleased before he schooled his face back to neutrality and put his glove back on. Wolfe took that as his cue and slid his riding gloves back on his hands. He felt a bit strange doing it, but he noticed that he wasn't alone. Though they were soft leather gloves, expensive and comfortable, almost all the better-dressed men in the room wore gloves. If he hadn't known about his ability to use magic, Wolfe would have simply assumed it was a preference of the senior family members. But now, Wolfe had just as many things to ask Uncle Ivan about as the old man had to ask him. As they mingled with the family, Ivan and Roman stayed close to Wolfe's side, introducing him to the various important members of the family. The only adult other than Uncle Ivan that he already knew well was Johnny, his boss at the courier company. His usually loud and crude boss was quite polite and subdued in the face of the two elders, and Wolfe noticed that he was one of the few wealthy men who weren't wearing gloves, despite his age and the respect he got from the others.
You know Johnny, yes? He married Roman's daughter, June.
Indeed I do. I've been a courier at his company for a number of years now.
Not a bad start. Couriers build a lot of muscle that'll come in handy later in life, especially a life like ours. But we can talk about fitness routines after dinner. Should be time for the ladies to return soon, then we can eat.
Come sit by me so I can introduce you to everyone.
Uncle Ivan motioned to Wolfe, cutting off their conversation without any hint of emotion on his face or in his voice. This was his business face. The man getting ready to flex his position as family head in front of the assembled guests. Wolfe was aware that his seat next to the patriarch was an honor, but the look on Johnny's face said he underestimated just how much of an honor it was. The courier company boss was almost green with envy, for in all the years since he had married into the family, he had never once been seated next to the patriarch. Still, the boy who worked for him got the honor the first time he attended dinner after his 18th birthday. Wolfe met a few of the ladies on his way to the head of the table, where he was seated between Ivan and Roman, in clear sight of anyone who looked toward the patriarch. There was a young woman beside Roman, next to Johnny, which must make her June, Roman's daughter. For the most part, Wolfe had already forgotten the other adults' names and their relation to the family.
Welcome again, Noxus family. It is good to see so many of you could come this month, for we have a special event today. Wolfe has just recently turned 18, and after some training, we have high hopes that he will be taking his rightful place in the family. Please treat him well, and make him feel at home as the youngest of your peers, eh?
Wolfe could see a few jealous looks at the news, all from men without gloves, which Wolfe had just now realized were the mark of the main family's men, the ones who could at least feel mana. One look among the crowd was very different from the others, and certainly not at all like the jealous ones he was getting from the men. A woman in a high-necked blouse that emphasized her neck and made her chubby cheeks look even larger than they should be was giving him a hungry look that made Wolfe's skin crawl. Not lust, though it was similar. The look on her face was pure greed, like he was a prize to be claimed. She was seated with an older woman who must be her mother, and a man in an expensive suit who had arrived just in time for dinner. There was a much smaller woman beside him, one Wolfe would have called a teenage girl had she not been sitting at the adults' table. That one stared directly at her plate, but Wolfe could see she was listening to the conversation. He hoped she gained some courage soon. The Noxus family was no place for the cowardly.
I see you noticed Melody and her sister. Melody finished her time at the Witches' Academy last year. Unfortunately, she didn't manage to pass her first year to be recognized as a competent witch and gain the benefits. But there is a good chance that her children could activate the gene.
Roman introduced the pudgy-faced young woman with a hint of pride. When witches had children with non-witches, the offspring usually had weaker magic until they eventually weren't witches at all. Melody was one of those cases. But there was always a chance that a prodigy could be born of her and her future husband, catapulting the family into nobility. That possibility alone would make her a highly desirable bachelorette to advancement-minded young men, and it was clear from her haughty demeanor that she knew it. Wolfe nodded politely, then looked to the younger sister, who had raised her head enough to look at him for a moment.
It's a pleasure to meet you both. I don't believe I caught your name.
This is Cassandra, who prefers to go by Cassie. She doesn't speak much, but she will be headed for training this semester as well.
Her father answered on her behalf, giving the silent daughter a gentle look.
Since the two training academies share a campus, perhaps you can keep an eye out for her. I'll give you the details after dinner, huh?
All eyes in the room turned to Wolfe, but the man in question didn't have a single clue what was going on yet. Other than some altered videos of witch idols, he had never taken any interest in knowing about the lives and training of the nobility. Until today, he hadn't been overly concerned with the Noxus family's traditions for their core members either. What he did know was that Uncle Ivan was going to tell him something after dinner, and the family's training must be part of it. Melody looked more than a little sour at the news that Wolfe and Cassie were going to be trained together. But Wolfe couldn't see what sort of training would have the two of them paired up in any meaningful way. He knew that the Noxus family men were trained to fight at various academies. That was no secret. Every crime family sent their youth out to be trained if they seemed promising enough to join the family business. He had learned today that many of the Noxus elders had an affinity for mana. But unless everything he knew about the Magi being totally exterminated during the Great War was a lie, they couldn't actually use magic. More importantly, it sounded like Cassie was going to attempt the witch proficiency tests, and that certainly had nothing to do with him, as male witches couldn't use magic either. The dinner passed quickly, with everyone making small talk to catch up on the month's news, and the end of the meal came much too suddenly when Uncle Ivan stood up from his chair and motioned for Wolfe and Roman to follow him out of the dining room. The guests around the table all stood to bow as he left, then returned to their desserts and gossip, much more at ease now that the head of the family was gone. Uncle Ivan led the two of them to his personal study, then activated the white noise filter and locked the door, soundproofing the room to protect against any attempts at eavesdropping.
What I need to tell you should not go beyond this room. In all the centuries that the Noxus family has been in the city, working to regain what we lost during the war, only 2 men have been born with a strong enough Magi bloodline to gather mana. The first was me. The second, I suspect, is you.
Wolfe paused in shock at that announcement.
You can use mana too?
Uncle Ivan nodded solemnly.
That's why we cover our hands. Anyone with an active witch or Magi bloodline can feel the strength of the mana in you through contact. That means every failed witch, every member of a rival family, and every female Coven security officer. Everyone who could possibly be a threat to your safety and livelihood is likely to be able to tell you that you have a much higher than usual affinity for mana. If they find out that you can actually use it, well, death is likely to be the better of the options to be left with. If you're going to progress, you need to train. I was caught and had my potential tested by the witches at an early age. Now, I hid my ability to use mana from them, and I was never strong. But even with their suspicion of my slight abilities, I have been under constant surveillance my whole life. That's also why the women of the family were so interested in you. The Coven's stronger witches keep a guardian, a sworn bodyguard of sorts that never leaves their side, or a humanoid familiar with them that they can use as a mana battery, kinda. Most of them are there for brute force or their innate mana. But if they could find a man with enough Magi and heritage to gather a bit of mana on his own, he could constantly stream it to a witch, greatly increasing her own capabilities. Now, Magi can store mana within themselves, but witches can't. They build up an aura that lets them draw mana more quickly instead. They have learned to store mana in objects like mana crystals. But if they are disarmed, they are in a bad spot since gathering mana for a spell takes a few seconds. Having a familiar that is strong enough to keep up with the demand cuts that time in half. That's why guardians exist, to cover them until they can cast their spells. Don't think that they are weak, though. Their spells are incredibly strong. They just aren't as fast as the Magi were said to have been. If you go to the Guardian Academy for a year, they will teach you about spells, so you can defend the witch against them. Use that knowledge to better yourself. It's a chance I didn't get because they caught on to my abilities too early, and I was forced to flee until I was too old for them to want me as a guardian anymore. After a year, if you haven't been chosen to accept a contract with the witch, they will expel you from the program, and you can return here to the family, where we will make sure you are well provided for. But if you do find a witch you like, that's your choice. Remember, the bond is for life, and they won't let you go if they realize how powerful you are.
Wolfe listened quietly through the entire speech, taking in the new information about the benefits to a witch of having a magic user as a guardian and what that could mean for him. There were some definite upsides, like a whole school full of sexy witches in their school uniforms. The uniforms were a legendary tier cosplay among the youth of the lower levels, so the real thing had to be better. Then there was the knowledge he could gain. He already knew that someone like him could use at least basic magical abilities without reagents. So he could take in a lot of what he needed to know just by proximity. But the risks were equally high. Being found out could lead to a life of being nothing more than a mana battery for some snobby and power-hungry noble witch. Once that happened, it was all over for him. Rumors said that the witches could track their guardians anywhere and see through their eyes. For that reason, kids in the lower levels hid from the guardians, and nobody but the witches knew if that was all they could do.
When you said that Cassie was going for training, you meant that she might have the potential to be an actual witch, right?
Well, she almost certainly does. The Noxus family has been around since before the war, which is why our bloodline is blended, and our daughters have the chance to be witches. That is also how we survived the culling at the end of the war, by relying on the witches in our own family to keep the remnants of the Magi bloodline going. All the men who could sense mana, or even strongly sense it, were killed. But the daughters who survived and didn't show enough potential to become witch nobles reformed the family, and quietly started seeking matches that would rebuild our heritage. I am old already, so her memory has faded among the younger generation. But my mother ruled the family for 60 years. Like the others from families who weren't selecting marriage partners with as pure of a witch heritage as possible, her ability had faded from what witches were once capable of. However, she still had enough magic to pass the Academy's first year before being expelled for low performance and becoming a commoner witch. Both you and Cassie will be going to the Academy. Her as a Coven applicant, and you as a squire. Find her an appropriate guardian if you can, as I believe she has it in her to pass the first tests. Once she finishes the first year, she will be a commoner witch, and our family territory will be recognized by the nobles again. It'll be a great thing for the Noxus family. If she can go further, she will become my successor, even if I have to kill her cow of a sister to keep her safe.
There was the ruthless Uncle Ivan, the family head that everyone knew best. Nothing was out of bounds if it was for the betterment of the family. Nothing at all. Wolfe knew that was why Uncle Ivan was so keen to send him to become a squire. The chance that he could attach himself to a stronger witch and bring them back to the family would be a fail-safe against Cassie failing. But Wolfe didn't really mind. Being convicted for being a Magi was a death sentence, and being caught with the ability to use magic but not convicted was no better. And Wolfe wasn't strong enough right now to protect himself. He needed to learn to master the powers he had, and to learn to fight better than any common brawler. Only then could he live his life without fear of abduction. He had at least some tiny bit of power, but he didn't have an entire family and a witch mother behind him as Uncle Ivan did in his youth. Even with that, Ivan had been forced to flee for years and was still under surveillance.
Just let me know when I need to leave, and I will be ready.
It was an order from the family head and not really a choice, but politely agreeing cost him nothing. Roman chose that moment to speak up, reminding Wolfe that he was still in the room.
There's 1 week until the applicants leave, but it's best that you stay here until then. We can clean out your apartment for you. but it's best not to go out and expose yourself to the schemes of others who have seen you enter the main family. At least not so soon after you've awoken your powers. I'll train with you until you leave. Uncle Ivan taught me the same way, and family records have a technique for building your power. Supposedly, it'll grant a worthy inheritor the legacy of the Noxus Archmages. Only time will tell how much it helps you.
Roman stood up from his chair and stepped to the bookshelf on the wall of the office. He took down a plain leather book, more of a folder than what Wolfe would have called a proper book, since it only held a few pages, and placed it on the table.
This is what we still know of how to advance as a Magi.
This pamphlet-sized book was a miracle to Wolfe. Until today, he thought all knowledge of the Magi was destroyed. But now, with this, he has a chance to see just how knowledgeable they once were. The surviving pages seem to be an introduction from a training manual, a basic oversight of what a young Magi needed to do to become worthy of the title. To the person who wrote it, this was probably the most obvious thing in the world. But the Magi were secretive, not letting the outside mundane world know of their power, for fear of exactly what happened to them in the end. The rest of the world ganging up to kill them. Wolfe looked over the first page, somewhat charred and missing small sections before it was preserved in this plastic cover.
The power of the Magi is that of the world, not the witch's power of life, but the primal indifference of the planet itself. Fire, lightning, and gravity are the building blocks of a Magi's power. The fire of the planet's core and the heat of the sun beating down on its surface are the strongest sources of fire imaginable by man. When a Magi is in tune with them, his control over fire becomes stronger. Lightning is the elusive element brought to life in the skies. It was once viewed as a niche affinity, but as science has grown, the power of electricity has become better known, tamed, and spread across every aspect of life. Once they have learned the flow of man-made lightning, a Magi can amplify it 1,000 times, bringing a city's technology to life or burning it to ash. Finally, we have the most essential of forces in the universe, gravity. The power to move the tides, fly through the air, bond or debond the atom. Gravity is the structure that the universe is built upon. For now, young student, you will be studying these 3 basic principles to find your strongest initial affinity.
The rest of the text was missing, but the knowledge that the surviving page had brought was life-changing. Wolfe was no fool. He graduated from high school and understood the concepts of gravity and the eternal heat of the stars burning in the sky. He even understood electricity well enough to modify his electric bike. But he suspected that was a much more shallow knowledge than what a Magi in the old world had. Gently, Wolfe flipped the page to see the backside, finding it mostly burnt black. But there was a single spell circle mostly visible, and a few words of description that were too isolated to link to the rest. It was very different from the one he used to charge the batteries for the power tools he sold.
Supposedly, that is part of the inheritance. But from what we can tell so far, it is a basic fire spell. From a drawn copy of the circle, I can conjure flames. From what my mother told me, once you know the circle, an actual Magi should be able to use it to mentally focus their energy to create the flames without actually drawing the circle. Think of it as a focusing aid, some training wheels. It'll turn your internal energy into an external fire. Or at least, that's the theory.
Wolfe took a picture of the circle with his phone and zoomed in close enough that the context was hidden. Magical circles were everywhere these days. At least they were on high-end items, so having a picture of one was unremarkable and could be explained as trying to avoid being scammed.
I'll test it later when I'm not taking up your time or, surrounded by so many books.
The first page was incredible, but the second made the fire circle look unimportant. It was almost all gone, burnt to ashes, but what remained was enough to be worth the effort of saving it.
To expand your mana pouch, the pressure will loosen the restriction. Continue until begin the second.
Wolfe idly flipped the page as he read and found that there was a diagram on the back of this one as well. Rank 7, Transition, was what the remains of the caption said, above a partial drawing of the human body with 7 orbs in the chest. 6 small ones orbiting a 7th larger orb. That was exactly where the energy in his chest seemed to congregate. So the diagram must be the way to build up mana storage. The 2 elders waited while Wolfe processed this new knowledge, wondering how much he could make of it on his own. When he looked satisfied but did not speak, Roman decided to add what he knew to the boy's understanding.
From what I've learned, putting pressure on your mana gland will cause it to swell a little in irritation, but the excess energy will flow into your body and fortify it. After years of practice, I'm much stronger than the average man.
That didn't sound right to Wolfe at all, and it didn't explain the part about beginning the second, or the diagram. It might be a side effect, but he was sure it wasn't the intended result.
What about if you hold it full? Does it permanently increase the capacity?
Roman shrugged.
Not for me, but it did for Uncle Ivan at the start. There is a chance that our affinity is just too low for what they were trying to teach.
Now that was an answer that made sense to Wolfe. Everyone knew that not all witch-blooded women were at the same level. They even had a failed student in their own family. Looking at it that way, the elders were like Melody. They had tried to improve their skills, but lacked the ability. The question now was if Wolfe could do any better. Wolfe placed his fingertips on the diagram of the human body, and the charred remains of the page began to glow with soft light as magic flowed up his hand, then wrapped around his forearm, leaving it covered in a magical circle filled with runic writing. Neither of the men in the room reacted to the sight at all, while Wolfe stared at his arm, reading the only legible words. Wolfe Noxus, Noxus clan heir. After a few seconds, Uncle Ivan closed and carefully placed the thin book back on the shelf, where it blended in among the identically bound business reports and family census folders. Nobody would ever look for it there, as the information on that shelf would only ever matter to the head of the family. Anyone looking for valuable information would surely start among the rare books or in the safe.
I'll show you to your room. You can practice tonight. Someone will come get you for breakfast, and I'll teach you what I know in the morning.
Roman opened the door and led a very confused Wolfe out into the hallway.
Thank you for listening to this sample of Inheritor of Magic, The Magi King, Part 1 by Aoki Aku. If you enjoyed this sample, you may listen to the rest of the story by purchasing it through www.kokoroaudio.com or from the platforms shown on screen.